The first time Maggie Boone ran from Silas Crane's house, she made it only as far as the county line before his men dragged her back by her hair, and she swore to herself that the next time she ran, she would not stop until an entire territory stood between them. That second chance came on a September night in 1878, when the lamps in the Crane mansion in Independence, Missouri burned low and the household slept, and Maggie slipped out through the kitchen door with nothing but a carpetbag, $40 she had hidden in the lining of her corset over 3 years, and a locket that held the only likeness she had left of her mother's face. She was 22 years old, and she had spent 7 of those years as the ward of a man who smiled at church socials and struck her with the back of his hand in private, a man who had been entrusted with her father's fortune when the fever took both her parents in the same terrible week, and who had since decided that the girl attached to that fortune was worth more to him married off than free. She did not look back at the house. She had learned long ago that looking back only slowed the running. By the time the sun rose over the Kansas plains, Maggie was on a train headed west, watching the flat gold land roll past the window and telling herself that somewhere beyond it, in the mountains people spoke of in hushed, half-frightened voices, there might be a place cruel men like Silas Crane could not follow. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet, and for now the not knowing let her breathe. The train carried her as far as the railhead in southern Montana Territory, and from there she paid the last of her coin for a seat on a stagecoach that rattled and bucked over roads that were barely roads at all, climbing steadily into country greener and wilder than anything she had known in Missouri. Pine forests climbed the slopes on either side of the trail. Peaks capped in old snow stood against a sky so blue it seemed to ache. The other passengers, 2 drummers and a preacher's wife, talked of the mining town at the end of the line, a place called Copper Ridge that had sprung up 8 years before when silver was found in the creek beds, and had grown into a rough but steady town of perhaps 600 souls, with a mercantile, 2 churches, and more saloons than either. Maggie arrived in Copper Ridge on a gray afternoon with rain threatening in the clouds that clung to the surrounding peaks, and she stood on the muddy boardwalk outside the stage office with her carpetbag in both hands, suddenly and completely aware that she knew not a single soul within 1,000 miles, and that the money in her corset would not last a month. It was there, within an hour of her arrival, that trouble found her, as it seemed always to do. 2 miners, unwashed and loud with drink though it was barely past noon, had taken an interest in the stagecoach's new arrival, and they followed her from the office to the mercantile with comments that made her cheeks burn and her stomach turn cold. She kept her eyes forward and her steps quick, the way she had learned to do around Silas's business associates, the ones who looked at her like she was a parcel of land to be surveyed and claimed. "Ain't seen a face that pretty come through Copper Ridge in a year of Sundays," one of them called, close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on him. "You lost, girl. Need somebody to show you around." "I'm not lost, and I do not need anything from you," Maggie said, keeping her voice steady though her heart hammered. The second miner laughed and reached for her arm, and that was when a voice like gravel rolling down a mountainside cut through the street. "She said she does not need anything from you." Maggie turned, and there, stepping down from the boardwalk in front of the trading post with a bundle of beaver pelts slung over one broad shoulder, was the largest man she had ever seen in her life. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the seams of a buckskin coat worn soft and dark with years of use, and forearms bared to the elbow that corded with muscle as he set the pelts down against a post. His hair was near black and long enough to brush his collar, tied back loosely, and a several days' beard shadowed a jaw that looked carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. But it was his eyes that stopped her, a startling clear gray, steady and unhurried, fixed now on the 2 miners with an expression that promised nothing good for them if they did not step back. "This ain't your business, Fletcher," the first miner said, though his voice had lost some of its swagger. "I am making it my business," the mountain man said. You will apologize to the lady, and then you will go on about whatever it was you were doing before you decided harassing a stranger off the stage was a fit way to spend your afternoon." The miners looked at him, looked at each other, and evidently decided that whatever silver they had found in the creek was not worth testing the patience of a man built like a granite outcropping. They muttered something that might have passed for an apology and hurried off down the street, and the big man turned to Maggie with an expression that had gentled entirely, as though he had not just faced down two armed miners without raising his voice above a low, even calm. "You are all right, ma'am?" he asked. "I am, thank you." Maggie found her voice smaller than she intended. "I did not expect to need rescuing quite so soon after stepping off the stage." A faint smile touched his mouth there and gone. "Copper Ridge can be rough on newcomers, especially ones traveling alone. Name is Seth Fletcher. Maggie Boone." She hesitated, then extended her hand, feeling foolish for the formality of it in the mud and noise of the street, but he took it in his, and his hand, though calloused and enormous around hers, was careful, as if he were holding something he did not wish to break. "Miss Boone." He released her hand and glanced at the carpetbag she still gripped. "You have folks here in Copper Ridge or business that brought you?" "No folks," she admitted. "I came to find work and a place to start over." Something shifted behind his gray eyes, some flicker of understanding that told her he had recognized more in her words than she had said aloud, the particular flatness of a voice describing a life left behind rather than a life given up willingly. But he did not press her. "There is a woman here, Abigail Hale, runs a boarding house 2 streets over. She is fair and she does not ask more questions than a body wants answered. I can walk you there if you like." Maggie studied him a moment, this stranger with the build of a bear and the manners of a gentleman, and decided that after 7 years of learning which men to fear, her instincts, battered as they were, told her this one was safe. "I would be grateful," she said. Abigail Hale's boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building at the quiet end of Copper Ridge's Main Street, with green shutters and a porch that looked out toward the mountains. And Abigail herself was a widow of perhaps 50 years with silver-streaked hair, and the brisk, no-nonsense manner of a woman who had buried a husband and 2 sons to accident and illness, and had decided that the only sensible response to grief was to keep her hands and her house busy. "Seth Fletcher," Abigail said when they arrived at her door, looking between the mountain man and the young woman at his side with open curiosity. "You are the last man in this territory I expected to see delivering a stray to my doorstep. She needed a decent place to stay, and yours is the only decent place in town," Seth said simply. Abigail's eyes crinkled at the corners, though her expression remained composed. "Well, come in out of the wet, both of you, before the sky opens up on us." Inside, the boarding house smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, and Maggie felt some of the tightness in her chest ease for the first time since she had left Independence. Abigail showed her to a small room at the top of the stairs, plain but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the back garden, and beyond it, the dark rise of forested foothills. "Rent is $4 a month, meals included," Abigail said. "I do not ask what a girl is running from, but I will say this much. Copper Ridge has taken in plenty who came here with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a reason to leave somewhere else. You will not be the first, and you will not be judged for it under my roof." Maggie's eyes stung unexpectedly at the kindness in that, and she had to look away toward the window until she trusted her voice again. "Thank you. I have some money, not much, but enough for a few weeks. I hope to find work before it runs out." "There is always work for a woman who can sew or cook or keep a ledger honest," Abigail said. "We will see what suits you." Seth had remained in the doorway during this exchange, seemingly unwilling to leave until he was satisfied the arrangement was settled, and now he cleared his throat. "I will be back through town in a week or 2, bringing pelts to trade before the snow closes the high passes," he said. "If you are still in need of anything, Miss Boone, you can leave word with Abigail." "You have already done more than I could ask," Maggie said. "I do not know how to repay such kindness." "You do not owe me anything," Seth said, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, that made her believe he meant it entirely. Then he tipped his hat, an oddly formal gesture from a man dressed in buckskin and trail dust, and was gone, his heavy footsteps receding down the stairs and out into the gathering rain. Maggie stood at the window a long while after he had left, watching the street below until his broad shape had vanished around the corner toward the trading post, and told herself that the strange warmth settling in her chest was only relief, only the ordinary gratitude owed to a stranger who had done a kindness. She was not yet ready to call it anything else. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Maggie had not known she was capable of missing until she had it. She found work within days, mending and altering clothes for the wives of the mine foremen and the shopkeepers, her needle quick and her eye sharp from years of being made to sew her own dresses under Silas's roof rather than be given new ones. Abigail took a liking to her, teaching her to bake the sourdough bread the boarding house was known for, and in the evenings the two women would sit by the fire while Abigail told stories of Copper Ridge's early days, when the silver strike had brought a flood of hopeful, desperate men into a valley that had, until then, known only elk and grizzly and the occasional trapper's cabin. Seth Fletcher came through town twice in October, each time with pelts to trade at the post, and each time he found some reason to call at the boarding house afterward, ostensibly to check that Maggie had settled well, though Abigail's knowing look suggested she believed his reasons ran deeper than concern for a stranger's welfare. On his second visit, he brought Maggie a small carved figure of a mountain lion, its lines simple but sure, whittled from a piece of pine. "I do not have much use for trinkets," he said, almost apologetically, as he set it on the boarding house's kitchen table where she sat with her sewing. "But I was working the knife one evening by the fire, and this came out of the wood, and I thought of you." "You thought of a mountain lion and thought of me?" Maggie asked, lifting an eyebrow, though she was already smiling as she picked up the little carving and turned it over in her fingers, admiring the care in its small, fierce face. "I thought of something that looks soft but is not," Seth said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded, and looked away toward the window with color rising faintly above his beard. "What I mean is, you do not look like a woman who has had an easy road, Miss Boone, but you do not carry it the way some do. You carry it like something you survived, not something that beat you." Maggie's fingers tightened around the little carving. No one, not Abigail with all her kindness, not the ladies she sewed for, had looked at her closely enough to see that particular truth, the one she herself had only half admitted, that she had survived Silas Crane's house, and that survival had cost her something, but not everything. "How did you know that?" she asked quietly, "when you have known me only a few weeks?" Seth was quiet a moment, turning his hat slowly in his big hands. "I lost my own folks when I was 17. Fever took my mother, and my father went into the mountains after that and never much came back out, not in his heart, though his body kept walking around for another 2 years before a fall off a ridge finished the job the grief had started. I came west after that, because I did not know how to be anywhere that reminded me of what I had lost. I have been alone in these mountains going on 11 years now, Miss Boone, and a man learns to read the weight other folks carry, because it is often the only company he keeps thinking on it." The honesty of that struck her somewhere deep and tender, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling low in the hearth and the wind picking up outside the window, carrying the first true cold of the coming winter. "My guardian was a cruel man," Maggie said finally, the words coming slow, as though each one had to be pried loose from a place she had kept locked for years. "My parents died when I was 15, and the court gave charge of me, and of my father's mining shares, to his old business partner, Silas Crane. He controlled everything, my money, my movements, who I was permitted to speak to. When I did not obey quickly enough, he had other ways of teaching obedience." She did not elaborate further, and Seth did not ask her to, though his jaw had tightened at her words, a muscle working there that spoke of some carefully controlled anger on her behalf. He is the reason you came alone to a territory 1,000 miles from anything you knew, Seth said. It was not a question. He had arranged to marry me to one of his business associates, Maggie said. A man twice my age who cared nothing for me and everything for the shares my father left me, which Silas would have controlled either way, married or not. I overheard them discussing the arrangement as though I were a parcel of land being sold at auction, and I decided that night that I would rather starve free in a territory I had never seen than live comfortable and owned in the house where I grew up. You are not owned by anyone now, Seth said, low and fierce. Not while there is breath in me to see that stays true. Maggie looked up at him, at the massive, steady shape of him sitting across Abigail's kitchen table, hat forgotten in his hands, gray eyes burning with a protectiveness she had not earned yet, and had certainly never been offered before, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 7 years loosened, just slightly, just enough to let her breathe a little deeper. "Thank you," she whispered. He stayed another hour that evening, talking of small things, the elk he had tracked through the high meadows, the way the aspens had turned gold almost overnight in the valley behind his cabin, and when he finally rose to leave, promising to return before the first heavy snow closed the passes for the season, Maggie found herself standing on the porch long after his broad shape had disappeared into the dusk, watching the empty street and feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that might have been hope. November brought the first real snow to Copper Ridge, and with it, trouble that Maggie had feared but had allowed herself to believe might not follow her so far. She was in the mercantile, selecting thread for a dress she was mending, when the bell over the door jangled and a man she had never seen entered, brushing snow from the shoulders of a fine gray coat that marked him as a stranger to Copper Ridge as surely as any accent could have. He was lean, with a thin mustache and small, calculating eyes that swept the store's interior with the practiced efficiency of a man, accustomed to finding what he sought quickly and without wasted motion. Maggie's blood went cold the instant those eyes found her. "Miss Boone," the man said, and his voice carried a courtesy that did nothing to soften the threat beneath it. "I have traveled a very long way to find you." "I do not know you," Maggie said, though her voice shook, and she took a step backward toward the counter, toward the shopkeeper, Mr. Danvers, who looked between them with growing confusion. "My name is Emmett Duke. I work for Mr. Silas Crane, who has been most distressed since your sudden and unexplained departure from Independence. He fears for your safety, traveling alone into such wild country. He has sent me to escort you home." "I am not going home," Maggie said, and though fear clawed at her throat, she was proud later of how steady she managed to make the words. "I am no longer a child, Mr. Duke, and Silas Crane is no longer my guardian by law. I turned 22 in August. There is no court order compelling me to return to that house." Duke's mouth twitched, something like amusement or contempt flickering across his thin features. "Mr. Crane holds certain shares and monies in trust for you, Miss Boone, which cannot be released without your cooperation. He is a patient man, but his patience is not infinite, and I would advise you to consider carefully what continued absence might cost you." "I want nothing from him. He may keep the money if it buys my freedom from him." "That is not his understanding of the arrangement," Duke said, and something in the flat certainty of his tone told Maggie this was no simple errand of concern, that there was money at stake far beyond what an inheritance alone might explain, though she did not yet understand how deep Silas Crane's need for her cooperation truly ran. Mr. Danvers, to his credit, stepped from behind the counter at that moment, a shotgun that had been resting beneath it now cradled, not quite pointed, but visible in his arms. "This young lady is a resident of Copper Ridge and a customer of this establishment, Mr. Whatever business you have with her, I would suggest you conduct it elsewhere and civilly, or not at all." Duke's eyes flicked to the shotgun, then back to Maggie, and whatever calculations ran behind that thin, careful face concluded, for the moment, in retreat. "I will find better opportunity to speak with you, Miss Boone. Copper Ridge is not so large a town that we shall not cross paths again." He touched his hat, an almost mocking courtesy, and left the mercantile, the bell jangling behind him with a cheerfulness entirely at odds with the dread now pooling in Maggie's stomach. She told Abigail everything that evening, the whole truth of Silas Crane's cruelty and the arrangement she had fled and the money that had, apparently, followed her even into the wilderness of Montana territory, and Abigail listened with her lips pressed thin and her hands still over the bread dough she had been kneading. "You will need to leave Copper Ridge," Abigail said finally. "At least until this Duke gives up the search, or until you have some protection stronger than a shopkeeper's shotgun and an old widow's spare room." "I have nowhere else to go," Maggie said, and the old despair, the one she thought she had begun to leave behind on the plains of Kansas, rose up cold and familiar in her chest. It was Abigail who suggested, gently, that perhaps Maggie did have somewhere if she was willing to ask, and it was Abigail who sent word the next morning, through a trapper passing through town, that Seth Fletcher should come to Copper Ridge as soon as he was able. He came within 2 days, arriving at the boarding house in the gray hour before dawn, his horse blowing hard from a fast ride through fresh snow, and when Abigail let him in and explained what had happened, his face went still and cold in a way Maggie had not yet seen on him, a stillness that spoke of violence held carefully in check. "Where is he now, this Duke?" Seth asked. "Staying at the hotel, I believe," Abigail said. "He has been asking questions around town, at the mercantile, the stage office, anywhere he thinks folks might know Maggie's business. Then he will find her eventually if she stays in town," Seth said. He turned to Maggie, and the coldness in his face gentled when his eyes met hers, though the intensity remained. "My cabin is 11 miles into the mountains, up a trail that is difficult even in good weather and near impossible for a man unfamiliar with the country, especially once real snow sets in. You would be safe there, Miss Boone, safer than anywhere in this territory, while we decide what is to be done about Crane and his man." "I could not ask that of you," Maggie said, though even as she spoke the words, some traitorous part of her heart was already imagining it. The mountains, the quiet, the safety of that broad and steady presence between her and every danger the world had ever shown her. "You are not asking," Seth said. "I am offering. There is a difference, and I would ask you to trust that I know it." She looked at him a long moment, at the snow melting in his dark hair, at the gray eyes that held nothing but steady, unhurried resolve, and she thought of Silas Crane's cold, calculating cruelty, and of Emmett Duke's thin, patient smile, and she made her decision. "I will need to pack what little I have," she said. They left before the town had properly woken, Maggie mounted behind Seth on his horse, her carpetbag lashed to the saddle, and Abigail standing on the porch in her shawl watching them go with an expression that was equal parts worry and satisfaction, as though she had engineered rather more of this outcome than she would ever admit to. The trail into the mountains climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine dusted white, the air growing colder and thinner with every mile, and Maggie found herself pressed close against Seth's broad back for warmth, her arms wrapped around a waist that felt solid as the mountains rising around them, and despite the fear that had chased her from Independence and now seemed to have found her again even here, she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with some surprise, as safety. "Are you frightened?" Seth asked, his voice carrying back to her over the sound of hooves crunching through snow. "Some," she admitted, "but not of you, never of you." He did not answer immediately, but she felt something shift in the set of his shoulders, some tension easing that she had not known was there, and when he spoke again, his voice was rougher than before. "That matters to me more than you know, Miss Boone." The cabin, when they reached it after nearly 3 hours of climbing, sat in a small clearing ringed by towering spruce, with a creek running nearby that had not yet frozen and a view, when the clouds parted, of a valley spread out below like something from a painting, gold and white and endless. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy, built of hewn logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch where furs were stretched and dried. And inside, a single main room held a wide bed, a table and 2 chairs, a black iron stove, and shelves lined with careful, orderly stores of dried meat and beans and coffee. "It is not much," Seth said, almost apologetically, as he set her carpetbag down near the hearth. "But it is warm, and it is far enough into the mountains that Duke would need to be either very foolish or very desperate to attempt the trail before spring." "It is more than enough," Maggie said, and meant it, looking around at the small, tidy space that smelled of wood smoke and pine and faintly of him. "Thank you, Seth." It was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of Mr. before it, and something flickered across his face at the sound of it, something warm and pleased that he seemed to try and fail to keep hidden. "I will set another cot near the stove for myself," he said. "You will have the bed." "I could not put you out of your own bed." "You are not putting me out of anything," he said, with the same quiet finality he had used before. "I have slept on colder ground than my own cabin floor more nights than I could count, Miss Boone. This will be no hardship." She did not argue further, understanding that this was a point on which he would not be moved, and understanding, too, some deeper part of the gesture, the careful, unspoken respect of it. A man ensuring that a woman who had spent years under another man's controlling hand would never feel, even for a moment, that she had traded one form of confinement for another. The days that followed settled into their own rhythm, different from the boarding house but no less full. Seth taught her to check the trap lines he kept along the creek, though he was careful, she noticed, to avoid the crueler sort of trap, and to check them often enough that no animal suffered longer than necessary, a small mercy that told her more about his character than any words could have. He taught her to build up the stove fire so it would burn slow and steady through the night, to recognize the tracks of elk and deer in the snow, to listen for the particular silence that meant a storm was coming down off the high peaks. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, and Seth told her of his years alone in the mountains, of the winter he had nearly lost 3 fingers to frostbite before he learned better how to read the weather, of the grizzly he had once faced down over a fresh kill, standing his ground not because he was fearless, but because he had understood, in that frozen moment, that running would only invite the attack he sought to avoid. And Maggie, in turn, told him more of her years with Sela's crane, of the small cruelties that had accumulated into something crushing, of the way she had learned to make herself small and quiet and unremarkable in hopes of drawing less of his attention, and of the terrible loneliness of grieving her parents in a house where no one had ever once asked how she felt about their loss. "You do not have to make yourself small here," Seth told her one such evening, the fire throwing warm light across his face, his gray eyes steady on hers in a way that made her chest ache with something she was only beginning to name. "Whatever you are, whatever you feel, however loud or quiet or difficult it is, you may be that fully in this cabin. I will not think less of you for it." Maggie's eyes filled unexpectedly, and she looked down at her hands rather than let him see the tears threatening to fall. "No one has ever said such a thing to me before." "Then I am glad to be the first," Seth said simply, and reached across the small space between them to cover her hand with his own, warm and rough and impossibly gentle, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, content to simply sit together in the firelight while the wind moved through the pines outside and the world, for once, felt entirely safe. It was on the 10th day at the cabin, with snow falling steadily outside the frosted windows, that Maggie finally allowed herself to acknowledge fully what had been growing in her heart since the moment she had watched a stranger step down from a boardwalk to defend her from 2 drunken miners. She had been mending one of Seth's shirts, the fabric worn thin at the elbows from years of hard use, while he worked at the table repairing a length of harness, and she found herself watching him without quite meaning to. The way his large hands moved with such surprising delicacy over the leather, the way a lock of dark hair had fallen loose from its tie and curled slightly against his temple, the quiet concentration in his gray eyes. "You are staring, Miss Boone," Seth said, without looking up, though the corner of his mouth had curved into something like a smile. "I am mending your shirt," Maggie said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "It requires close attention." "Does it require quite so much attention to my face as to the shirt itself?" She had no ready answer for that, and the silence stretched between them, charged now with something neither had yet spoken aloud, until Seth set down the harness and looked at her fully, his expression grown serious. Maggie. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his low, rough voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "I have not known you long by most measures. 2 months, perhaps, since I first saw you standing outside the stage office, looking as though the whole world had turned against you. But I have thought of little else since, and I find that the thought of you leaving this cabin, leaving these mountains, leaving me, when the danger has passed, sits in my chest like a stone I do not know how to set down." Maggie's needle stilled entirely, her hands trembling faintly in her lap. "Seth, I am not a man of fine words," he continued, plowing ahead now as though he had rehearsed this and feared losing his courage if he stopped. "I have lived alone in these mountains for 11 years, and I had made my peace with that, told myself a solitary life suited me well enough, that I did not need what other men seemed to want, a wife, a family, a house full of noise. And then you arrived, and every certainty I had built for myself these 11 years came apart like ice breaking on the creek in spring. I do not know how to say this gently, so I will simply say it plain. I love you, Maggie Boone. I have loved you, I think, since the first evening you told me about the mountain lion carving and looked at me as though I had said something worth remembering. I do not expect you to feel the same, not so soon, not after everything Crane put you through, but I could not keep it inside me any longer without it becoming a lie between us." Maggie set down the mending entirely, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must surely hear it in the quiet cabin, and she crossed the small distance between them until she stood before his chair, looking down into those steady gray eyes that had, in 2 short months, become the safest thing she had ever known. "You are wrong about one thing," she said softly. "What is that?" "That I would need time. I think I began falling in love with you the day you told those miners to apologize, and I have simply been too frightened, until this moment, to say so aloud, because every time before now that I trusted a man with my heart, he found some way to use that trust against me. But you have never once in all these weeks asked anything of me that I did not offer freely. You gave me your bed and slept on the floor. You brought me carvings from wood instead of promises made only to be broken. You told me the truth about your own grief before you asked to hear mine. I love you, Seth Fletcher, and I am not afraid to say it, because for the first time in 7 years, I am not afraid of anything at all when I am with you." Seth rose from the chair slowly, as though he feared any sudden movement might shatter the fragile, precious thing unfolding between them, and he reached up to cup her face in one enormous, careful hand, his thumb brushing gently across her cheekbone. "May I kiss you, Maggie? Please," she whispered. His mouth met hers softly at first, a question more than a claim, and when she answered by winding her arms up around his neck and pressing closer, the kiss deepened, warm and slow and full of everything neither of them had dared say aloud until now. He held her as though she were something precious and hard-won, one hand splayed against the small of her back, the other still cradling her jaw, and Maggie felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely cherished. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Seth rested his forehead against hers, and a low, rough laugh escaped him, full of wonder. "I did not expect when I rode into Copper Ridge that day to trade pelts that I would ride home a changed man. Neither did I expect, when I stepped off that stagecoach, that I would find the safest place I have ever known at the top of a mountain trail," Maggie said, smiling against his lips. They remained that way a long while, wrapped together by the fire while the snow fell steadily outside. And for that night at least, the fear that Silas Crane and his man Emmett Duke represented felt very far away indeed. But the mountains, however safe they felt, could not hold back the world forever, and trouble found them again before the month was out. It was Abigail Hale who sent word this time, via a young trapper named Cody who made the difficult climb to Seth's cabin in a driving sleet, his face grim with the news he carried. "Duke has not left Copper Ridge," Cody reported, warming his hands at the stove while Maggie fetched him coffee and Seth listened with his jaw set tight. "Worse, he has brought Silas Crane himself into the territory." They arrived on the last stage before the passes closed for the winter, and Crane has been to the county land office asking after Maggie's whereabouts, claiming she is his ward and mentally unfit to manage her own affairs, and that he seeks only to bring her home for her own protection. "That is a lie," Maggie said, her voice sharp with fury even as fear coiled cold in her stomach. "I am not his ward. I have not been his ward since August." Mrs. Hale said the same, Cody agreed. "But Crane has money, and money buys a great deal of cooperation from folks who do not know the truth of the matter. There is talk of a warrant, or something like it, being sought to compel your return, on grounds that you left his household without proper release from guardianship, on account of some paper he claims was never filed with the courts." Seth's hands had curled into fists at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous in a way Maggie had not heard from him before. "He means to steal her freedom through paperwork what he cannot take by force." "That is my read of it also," Cody said. "Mrs. Hale asks that you come to town, Mr. Fletcher, and bring Miss Boone if she is willing. She says there is a circuit judge due through Copper Ridge within the week, a fair man by reputation, and that Miss Boone's best chance is to face this Crane directly, before the judge, with witnesses to speak on her behalf, rather than hide in the mountains and let him build his lies unchallenged." Maggie felt the old fear rising, the instinct to flee deeper into hiding rather than face Silas Crane's calculated cruelty directly. But she made herself breathe through it, made herself remember that she was no longer the frightened 15-year-old girl who had first come under his control, and that Seth Fletcher stood beside her now, not behind her, not in front of her blocking her own choices, but beside her, exactly where she needed him. "I will go," she said. "I will not spend the rest of my life running from a man who has already stolen 7 years from me. If there is a judge who will hear the truth, I mean to tell it." Seth crossed the room and took her hands in his. "You will not face him alone, Maggie. Whatever comes of this, I will be standing next to you." They rode down from the mountain the following morning, the trail treacherous with fresh ice, and arrived in Copper Ridge by early afternoon to find the town humming with the particular tension that comes when outsiders with money and grievances arrive to disturb a quiet community's routine. Abigail met them at the boarding house with news that Silas Crane had taken rooms at the hotel and had already spoken to half the town's merchants, spreading his version of events, that his poor, unfortunate ward had fled a comfortable home in a fit of hysteria, likely encouraged by some unscrupulous man in the territory who sought to take advantage of her fragile state and her inheritance. "He is calling you unstable," Abigail said grimly, "and he is none too subtle about implying that Mr. Fletcher here has designs on your money rather than honest affection." "That is absurd," Seth growled. "I have never once asked after her inheritance, nor cared what became of it." "I know that and you know that," Abigail said. "But Crane is building a story for a judge who does not know either of you, and stories, told persuasively enough, can bend even fair-minded men." Maggie's hands had begun to tremble, old fear resurfacing at the thought of facing Silas Crane again, of standing in a room while he smiled his cold, practiced smile, and painted her as broken and unreliable, exactly as he had always done within the walls of his own house, where no one but her had ever witnessed the truth of his cruelty. "There is one thing that might help," Abigail said carefully. "I have written, these past weeks since you told me your story, to a lawyer I know in Helena, a woman by the name of Constance Whitfield, who has some experience in matters of guardianship and inheritance law. She responded only yesterday. She says that if Silas Crane's claim rests on a guardianship paper never properly filed, as Duke suggested, then his entire position may be built on nothing more than bluff and intimidation, and that a judge, presented with the actual court records from Missouri, would very likely see through it entirely. How would we obtain such records, all the way from Missouri, before the circuit judge arrives? Maggie asked. We would not need to obtain the originals, Abigail said. Miss Whitfield says a formal request, telegraphed to the Jackson County Courthouse in Independence, requesting confirmation of the guardianship's legal termination upon your 21st birthday, should suffice, provided the judge is willing to wait the few days necessary for a response. Given that Crane's entire claim depends on urgency, on convincing the judge to act before such confirmation could arrive, I suspect he will fight hard against any delay. It took 2 days of careful arrangement, telegraphed messages sent and received through the small telegraph office attached to the stage line, and a great deal of quiet, steady reassurance from Seth, who remained at Maggie's side through every hour of waiting, before the circuit judge, a weathered, sharp-eyed man named Judge Hollis Bramwell, arrived in Copper Ridge and agreed to hear the matter in the town's small courthouse, really little more than a single room above the sheriff's office, but grand enough in the moment to feel like the whole of Maggie's future hung upon its walls. Silas Crane arrived at the hearing dressed in his finest gray suit, his silver-topped cane clicking against the floorboards with each measured step, Emmett Duke a silent, watchful shadow at his shoulder. And when his eyes found Maggie seated beside Seth Fletcher, something cold and calculating flickered across his face before he arranged his features into an expression of wounded, patient concern. "Margaret," he said, using the full name she had not gone by in years, his voice carrying the same false warmth she remembered from 100 church socials and dinner parties where he had performed the role of devoted guardian for an audience while reserving his cruelty for the privacy of his own house. "You look well. I confess I have been beside myself with worry." "You need not have worried, Mr. Crane," Maggie said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I am quite well and quite capable of managing my own affairs, as I have been since my 21st birthday." "That is precisely the matter I wish to address, Your Honor," Crane said, turning smoothly to the judge. "My ward suffered a great shock at the loss of her parents at a tender age, and I fear the years since have left her prone to fits of fancy and poor judgment regarding her own welfare. The guardianship papers filed with the Jackson County Court specify continued oversight until such time as a suitable marriage arrangement could be secured, given the delicate nature of her inheritance and her, shall we say, impressionable temperament." "That is a lie," Maggie said, rising from her chair despite the tightening grip of fear in her chest, because she had promised herself she would not sit silent while he spoke falsehoods over her once again. "The guardianship terminated upon my 21st birthday, as is standard under Missouri law absent any specific extension ordered by the court, and no such extension was ever sought, because you knew a judge reviewing the arrangement honestly would have seen exactly what it was, a means of controlling my father's mining shares for your own benefit. Your Honor, you can see for yourself the hysteria I have described," Crane said smoothly, though a thin sheen of sweat had appeared at his temple. Judge Bramwell, who had been listening with a carefully neutral expression throughout, held up one weathered hand. "I have here a telegraphed response from the clerk of the Jackson County Courthouse, received this very morning, confirming that the guardianship of Margaret Boone terminated automatically upon her 21st birthday in August of this year, absent any petition for extension, of which none was filed." The clerk further notes, and I find this detail most illuminating, gentlemen, that an inquiry was made into the status of certain mining shares held in trust for Miss Boone, and that a preliminary audit, requested by the court following receipt of my own telegraph inquiry 3 days past, has revealed irregularities in the accounting of those shares' dividends over the past 4 years. Dividends that appear to have been withdrawn and never properly credited to the ward's account. The color drained entirely from Silas Crane's face. "Your Honor, I can explain those figures. I am certain you believe you can," Judge Bramwell said dryly. "However, that explanation is now a matter for the Missouri courts, and I suspect for the federal marshal's office, given the sums the clerk described. As for the matter before this court, I find no legal basis whatsoever for Mr. Crane's claim of continued guardianship over Miss Boone, who has been, since August of this year, a free and legally independent woman entitled to make her own choices regarding her residence, her associations, and her affairs, without interference from Mr. Crane or his agent." Emmett Duke, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, now shifted uneasily near the door, clearly recalculating whatever plans he had carried into the room, and when Judge Bramwell's sharp eyes fell upon him next, he seemed to shrink slightly within his fine gray coat. "Mr. Duke, I understand you traveled to this territory in the employ of Mr. Crane for the purpose of compelling Miss Boone's return. Given what has just come to light regarding the funds you were, presumably, being paid from, I would advise you to consider very carefully whether continued association with Mr. Crane serves your own interests, or whether it might be wiser to distance yourself before the marshal arrives to sort through this matter properly." Duke said nothing further, but he was gone from Copper Ridge within the day, and word reached them a week later, through the same telegraph lines that had saved Maggie's freedom, that Silas Crane had been arrested in Bozeman attempting to board a stage east, and that federal marshals in Missouri had already begun proceedings against him for embezzlement of trust funds belonging to no fewer than 3 wards under his care over the years, Maggie among them. It was, Maggie thought, standing outside the little courthouse in the cold, bright winter sunshine with Seth's arm warm and solid around her shoulders, the first time in 7 years she had watched Silas Crane's careful, cruel composure crack entirely, and the sight of it, rather than bringing her the fierce satisfaction she might have expected, brought instead something quieter and more healing, the simple, settling knowledge that it was finally, truly over. "You did that," Seth said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple as they walked back toward the boarding house through streets crusted with old snow. "You stood in that room and told the truth when it would have been easier, safer even, to stay quiet and let the judge sort it out on his own. That took more courage than facing down any bear I ever met in these mountains." "I had help," Maggie said, leaning into him. "Abigail and her lawyer friend and you, standing beside me through every hour of waiting. You would have found the courage regardless," Seth said. "I have watched you these past months, Maggie Boone. You are not a woman who needs saving so much as a woman who has simply never before been given the chance to save herself, with someone standing near enough to catch her if she stumbled." Maggie stopped walking and turned to face him fully in the middle of the snowy street, heedless of who might see them, and rose up to press a slow, grateful kiss to his mouth. "Then I am glad it was you standing near enough, Seth Fletcher, and no one else." They were married in the spring, once the mountain passes had cleared, and the wildflowers had begun their slow climb up the valley slopes, in a small ceremony held on the porch of the boarding house with Abigail Hale standing as witness, alongside half the town of Copper Ridge, who had, over the winter months, come to regard the quiet young woman who mended their clothes and the solitary mountain man who traded his pelts at the post as something like a fixture of the community. 2 people whose story of hardship and rescue and unlikely love had become, by spring, one of Copper Ridge's most beloved tales. Maggie wore a dress of pale blue cotton that Abigail had helped her sew through the long winter evenings, and Seth stood before the traveling preacher who had happened through town that week, dressed in a coat that fit him properly for perhaps the first time in a decade, his dark hair combed back, and his gray eyes fixed on Maggie with an intensity that made her breath catch every time she glanced his way. "Do you, Seth Fletcher, take this woman to be your wife, to protect and cherish her in the mountains and out of them, in fear and in safety, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Seth said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a certainty that seemed to settle over the whole gathered crowd like a promise made not just to Maggie, but to the entire watching town. "I have spent 11 years learning to survive alone in wild country, and I mean to spend the rest of my years learning how to build a home instead with her. And do you, Margaret Boone, take this man to be your husband, to trust him and love him, in the mountains and out of them, in fear and in safety, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Maggie said, her voice steady and sure in a way it had never once been in Silas Crane's house, in a way she had not known, 7 years earlier, that she would ever be permitted to sound. "I came to this territory afraid of everything, and I found, instead, the one place in the world where I have never once had to be afraid again." They built their life together in the years that followed, splitting their time between the mountain cabin, which Seth expanded steadily over the following seasons into a home with 2 full rooms and a stone hearth wide enough to hold the growing family that would eventually fill it, and a small house in Copper Ridge itself, close to Abigail, who had become something like a mother to Maggie in all the ways that mattered, and who insisted on being close enough to spoil whatever grandchildren might come. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Maggie's father, was born in the autumn of 1879, delivered in the mountain cabin with Abigail, and the town's doctor both in attendance, and Seth, who had faced down grizzlies and blizzards and armed miners without flinching, paced the length of the cabin's porch for 6 straight hours in a state of terror he later admitted was worse than anything the wilderness had ever thrown at him, until the doctor finally called him inside to meet his son. Red-faced and squalling and perfect, cradled against Maggie's exhausted, radiant smile. "He has your stubbornness already," Maggie told him, as Seth knelt beside the bed and touched one enormous, careful finger to his son's tiny hand. "He has been fighting his way into the world for the better part of a day." "Good," Seth said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. "This territory rewards stubbornness. I mean to see he has plenty of it." A daughter followed 2 years later, whom they named Abigail after the woman who had given them both a home when they had nowhere else to turn. And then, 4 years after that, a second son, Seth Fletcher insisting, over Maggie's laughing protests, that the boy be named for his own father, a man Seth rarely spoke of but whose memory, Maggie understood, had found some measure of peace in watching his son build the very home and family that grief had once stolen from him. Copper Ridge grew steadily around them through those years, the silver strike giving way eventually to more permanent industries, ranching and timber, and the steady trade that came with a well-situated town along the growing network of roads and rail lines pushing further into Montana territory. And Seth, whose knowledge of the mountains and their dangers had become something of local legend, found steady work, guiding survey parties and timber crews through the high passes. Work that paid better and kept him closer to home than his years of solitary trapping ever had, though he never entirely gave up the traplines along the creek near their cabin, teaching each of his children in turn to read the tracks in fresh snow and to check the lines gently, without cruelty, exactly as he had once taught their mother. Silas Crane, they learned through occasional letters from Constance Whitfield, the Helena lawyer who had helped secure Maggie's freedom, was convicted in a Missouri courtroom the following year of embezzling funds from no fewer than 3 wards under his guardianship, and sentenced to a term in the state penitentiary that would keep him well away from Montana territory, and from Maggie, for the whole of the following decade. She read the news of his conviction on the porch of their mountain cabin with Seth's arm around her shoulders and their infant daughter asleep in her lap, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she felt no triumph in it, no lingering satisfaction, only a settled, peaceful relief that the last thread connecting her to that old fear had finally, fully been cut. "Do you ever think of him?" Seth asked her once, years later, when Thomas was near grown and beginning to help with the trapline himself, and their daughter Abigail had taken to riding out with Seth on his survey work, fearless in a way that made her mother's heart swell with a fierce, proud love. "Rarely," Maggie admitted, watching their children move through the golden autumn light of the valley below their porch. "When I do, it is only to remember how frightened I was, and to feel grateful all over again that fear did not win. You made certain of that, Seth Fletcher. From the very first day, you stepped down off that boardwalk and told two drunken miners to leave me be." "I only did what any decent man would have done," Seth said, though the pride in his voice, the quiet satisfaction, told her he knew exactly how much more than that single act of decency he had given her in the years since. "No," Maggie said, turning in his arms to press her palm against the solid, familiar warmth of his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her hand exactly as it had been every day since she had first trusted it with her own frightened heart. "You did far more than any decent man would have done. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me safety when I had forgotten what safety felt like. And you gave me a love I did not believe existed, not for a woman like me, not after everything Sela's Crane tried to convince me I was worth. I came to this territory to escape a man who wanted to own me, and I found instead a man who wanted only to see me free, and who loved me enough to stand beside that freedom rather than in front of it." Seth's arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion that 13 years of marriage had not diminished in the slightest. "Then I have done exactly what I set out to do the day I first saw you standing outside that stage office, looking like the whole world had turned against you. I set out to make certain you never had to feel that fear again, Maggie Boone Fletcher, not for one single day of the rest of your life." "You succeeded," she whispered against his chest, as the sun set gold and glorious over the mountains that had once seemed to her a desperate, frightened refuge, and had become, in all the years since, simply home. "Every single day you succeeded." They stood together on that porch as the evening settled cool and quiet over the valley, their children's voices carrying faint and happy on the wind from the meadow below. And Maggie thought, as she had thought so many times in the years since a mountain man's steady gray eyes had first found hers on a muddy Copper Ridge street, that she had traveled 1,000 miles to escape a cruel man's grip, and had found, at the end of that long and frightened journey, a love so vast and so gentle that fear itself had simply had no room left to survive within it. The years continued to unfold gently after that, each season bringing its own small joys, the children growing tall and capable under both their parents' careful teaching, Thomas eventually taking over much of the trapline work as Seth's own knees grew less eager for the steep climbs of his younger years, though his shoulders remained broad and strong well into his later years, a testament to a lifetime spent working with his hands and his back against the demands of wild country. Abigail Fletcher, named for the woman who had first opened her door to a frightened stranger, grew into a young woman known throughout the valley for her fearless riding and her sharp, capable mind, eventually courted by a young rancher's son whose family had settled in the valley some years after the Fletchers themselves. And Maggie watched her daughter's careful, happy courtship with a private, satisfied smile, recognizing in the young man's patient, respectful manner something of the same steady goodness she had found in his father's namesake all those years before. Abigail Hale herself lived to see all 3 of the Fletcher children grown, dying peacefully in her sleep at the boarding house she had run for over 30 years, surrounded by a town that had come to regard her as something between a mother and an institution. And Maggie grieved her as she might have grieved a blood relation, understanding fully, by that point in her life, that family was measured not in shared blood but in shared kindness, in doors open to strangers and rooms offered without judgment. in the quiet, steady decency that asked for nothing in return beyond the simple continuation of that same kindness, passed on to others. And through all of it, through births and small griefs and the steady accumulating years, Seth Fletcher remained exactly what he had promised on their wedding day to be. A man who protected without controlling, who loved without demanding, who had built, log by careful log, a home in the mountains sturdy enough to hold every fear Maggie Boone had once carried, and gentle enough to let that fear finally, fully, rest. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and settled with families of their own scattered through the valley below, Seth and Maggie would still sit together on the porch of the cabin he had built for her, watching the same mountains that had once seemed so vast and frightening to a young woman fleeing everything she had ever known. And Maggie would think sometimes of that first terrified night slipping out of Sela's Crane's house with nothing but a carpetbag and 40 hidden dollars, and marvel at the distance, not measured in miles but in years and love and safety, that separated that frightened girl from the woman she had become. "I would do it all again," she told Seth once on one such evening, her head resting against his shoulder while the last light faded gold and rose over the peaks that had become, over 3 decades, simply the shape of home. Every frightened mile of it, every terrifying moment in that courtroom, all of it, if it led me here again to you, to this. "I would not wish the fear on you twice," Seth said, pressing a kiss to the crown of her graying hair, his voice still carrying the same low, steady warmth it had held the very first day he spoke to her outside that stage office. "But I am endlessly grateful it led you to me all the same." The mountains kept their silent watch above them, as they always had, as they always would, and Maggie Boone Fletcher, who had once believed herself destined to spend her whole life afraid, closed her eyes against her husband's shoulder and felt, as she had felt every day for over 30 years, entirely and completely safe.